So we felt there was a need to give those social movements an electoral expression because they weren't being given expression by the social democratic parties. In Ireland, in particular, the Labour Party. The Irish Labour Party, for your listeners and viewers, information, it was one of the weakest social democratic type parties or Labour type parties in Europe. Irish politics has been dominated by two centre-right parties whose origins lay in the Irish Revolution and the Irish Civil War, called Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And they absolutely dominated Irish politics since the foundation of the Irish state in 1922. And there was never, for example, a left-led or social democratic-led government in the entire history of the state. That's still true, by the way. But the Social Democratic Party, which is called the Labour Party in Ireland, had time and time again, when they had seen surges of support, ended up going into coalition with the centre-right, propping up a bigger right-wing party. And that, in our view, had done a lot of damage to the credibility of left-wing politics. And it meant that left-wing politics was always the poor relation. It was always, nobody really believed they were ever going to come to power, that there was going to be a left-wing government, because they always propped up the centre-right. And it usually did a lot of damage to them and to their credibility. So we believed there was a need for a left-wing force, electoral force, that would not prop up the right, but that would actually campaign for a left-wing government in Ireland for the first time. So that was the thinking behind People Before Profit. And I should say the other big force in the Irish political scene and sort of dominant opposition force to the two centre-right parties would be a sort of radical nationalist party called Sinn Féin, who would have been linked to the IRA campaign of the the 70s and 80s and so on. So they are also a significant opposition force to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but they would be sort of radical nationalist. And that also had always meant that the radical left were small, So I suppose it's into that space that People Before Profit was trying to insert a new force of radical and revolutionary left politics.
Welcome to another episode of The Left Agora. My name is Akif, and today I'm joined by Richard Boyd Barrett, prominent and long-standing voice on the Irish left and a leading figure of People Before Profit. He has served as a member of the Irish Parliament since 2011. We had an insightful conversation covering his party, the state of the left in Ireland and across Europe, and recent international developments. And now, here is my conversation with Richard Boyd Barrett. Mr. Barrett, it's a great pleasure to speak with a politician of your experience. Thank you very much for being here with us today. I would like to begin with People Before Profit itself and how you see its place within the Irish left. Then we can broaden the discussion to the wider state of the left in Europe and some recent international developments. For an international audience that may not be very familiar with Irish politics, how would you describe where People Before Profit sits within the Irish left? There are different ways. Your party is characterized sometimes in quite specific ideological terms in the media and other sources. How do you define the party's ideological identity in your own words?
I would describe us as the socialist left or the radical left, and I think many, if not most, or many of those involved in People Before Profit would also explicitly identify themselves as revolutionary socialists. Although People Before Profit is a broader alliance than that. But many of those who were involved in founding it and who would still play a leading role in it would be from the revolutionary socialist tradition. But People Before Profit was precisely set up out of the belief that revolutionary socialists needed to build a broader electoral and political platform to reach to an audience that mightn't self-identify as socialist or revolutionary, but who would actually identify with many of the aspirations and objectives of radical socialists.
Yeah. And how does it differ from other left-wing parties in the Irish politics, particularly in the parliament? But you can, of course, also mention other extra-parliamentary forces as well.
Yes. First of all, we arose from the social movements and from the radical grassroots movements. So when it was first set up, it really was people from the revolutionary tradition who would have been involved in lots of grassroots campaigns, like the opposition to the UK-led war against Iraq in 2003, but movements on climate, climate justice, looking for radical climate action, but also grassroots campaigns about public housing, opposition to privatization. We had big campaigns in this country fighting against efforts to privatize waste and water services. So there was a whole number of grassroots campaigns where small forces of revolutionary socialists who didn't have any electoral expression would have been central to those big movements. So we felt there was a need to give those social movements an electoral expression because they weren't being given expression by the social democratic parties. In Ireland, in particular, the Labour Party. The Irish Labour Party, for your listeners and viewers, information, it was one of the weakest social democratic type parties or Labour type parties in Europe. Irish politics has been dominated by two centre-right parties whose origins lay in the Irish Revolution and the Irish Civil War, called Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And they absolutely dominated Irish politics since the foundation of the Irish state in 1922. And there was never, for example, a left-led or social democratic-led government in the entire history of the state. That's still true, by the way. But the Social Democratic Party, which is called the Labour Party in Ireland, had time and time again, when they had seen surges of support, ended up going into coalition with the centre-right, propping up a bigger right-wing party. And that, in our view, had done a lot of damage to the credibility of left-wing politics. And it meant that left-wing politics was always the poor relation. You know, it was always, nobody really believed they were ever going to come to power, that there was going to be a left-wing government, because they always propped up the centre-right. And it usually did a lot of damage to them and to their credibility. So we believed there was a need for a left-wing force, electoral force, that would not prop up the right, but that would actually campaign for a left-wing government in Ireland for the first time. So that was the thinking behind People Before Profit. And I should say the other big force in the Irish political scene and sort of dominant opposition force to the two centre-right parties would be a sort of radical nationalist party called Sinn Féin, who would have been linked to the IRA campaign of the the 70s and 80s and so on. So they are also a significant opposition force to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but they would be sort of radical nationalist. And that also had always meant that the radical left were small, you know? So I suppose it's into that space that People Before Profit was trying to insert a new force of radical and revolutionary left politics.
Speaking of conceptualizations, in my opinion, there is no doubt that People Before Profit is a radical left party. But in the case of Sinn Féin, some scholars occasionally identify this party also as a part of the radical left party family. But you basically described this party as as a radical nationalist party. So given that you definitely don't consider it within the radical left party family in Europe, right?
It's a complicated question,
Complex.
but ultimately, no, I don't. I think they're a radical nationalist party. Now, it is important to say that their base, their electoral base, is working class, overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but certainly in the cities would be working class. And in fact, people before Profit's electoral base, and we're smaller, they're considerably bigger now than us, but we have a system of proportional representation with transferable votes. So our voter base and their voter base is almost exactly the same voter base. So very typically, you would get people who would vote number 1 on the list for people before Profit and number 2 for Sinn Féin, or vice versa. Number 1 for Sinn Féin, number 2 for people before Profit. And the other parties that would be somewhat in that mix would be the Labour Party. And now there's another social democratic party called the Social Democrats, who have emerged in the last number of years, partly because of disillusionment with the Labour Party. But the voter base of people before Profit and the voter base of Sinn Féin is almost indistinguishable. It'd be overwhelmingly the manual working class. And that voter base would see us as very similar. They would see us as more left-wing, as more radical on social issues, and as probably more revolutionary, but would also see Sinn Féin as left. And, one of the things that we're very much promoting, people before Profit are very much proposing, is the idea of left unity to build a left front against the centre-right parties and the right-wing parties. And yes, we would cooperate and work with Sinn Féin and with the other social democratic parties in that context. We would actively work with them. So we would seek out to build coalitions with them inside and outside Parliament where there's common ground. So although we would define them as radical nationalist, there is no doubt they have quite a left-wing working class base. There's many within Sinn Féin might see themselves as socialist Republicans, but there is also a sort of nationalist dimension. And certainly on social issues and certain issues, they can take more conservative positions. And also, very importantly, they have not ruled out themselves making deals, coalition deals with right-wing parties. That's something we would not do. But they have said they are willing to consider such options, which we think is a mistake.
Yeah, that's one of the major differences alongside many. These are great insights. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And these are actually topics that I really love to discuss, but I would like to move to another question. If I may broaden the discussion from the Irish context to a wider one, I would like to ask about the state of the left across Europe at this point. Maybe I can divide my question into two. Given your long experience in both activism and parliamentary politics, how do you assess the current state of the left across Europe and perhaps globally? While there have been some national level successes, which I still think are crucial, the left doesn't seem to have a broader international momentum. For instance, in the 2010s, even if it ultimately fell short, there seemed to be a greater visibility also in international media, and a stronger sense of hope and political energy around left-wing movements and observers, supporters, in my opinion. At the same time, some on the left were already quite pessimistic about those developments back then. Maybe I should also note this. So my second question Why do you think that a wider, stronger wave hasn't emerged in recent years? More international cooperation between left-wing actors, more transnational party structures, or something else? What is needed to generate a new wave of that kind of energy? I would really appreciate to hear your opinions as an experienced politician.
In one way, that is a complicated political question about, the different politics of the left and also what's happened over the last decade or couple of decades. But in another way, it's a very simple question. And you could boil it down to one word: struggle. Struggle. Working class struggle. Or the lack of it. And
The lack of it.
the lack of it. Because I think the left gains prominence, and a sense of hope and optimism builds up when there are serious mass mobilizations on the streets and when workers are fighting back as workers. And I think we have had a lack of that, a significant lack of that over the last decade. I mean, I think about people before profit, for example, as a concept, as a force, really developed out of the anti-globalization, anti-capitalist movement and the anti-war movement, starting from around 2001, 2002, 2003 period. That's where people before profit came from. I mean, many of us were active before that, but we were very, very small forces. But where a new left began to develop, including people before profit, but I think there were other instances of that across Europe. It was when you had a mass anti-war movement on the streets globally because of the Iraq War. You had the anti-globalization movement starting in Seattle in 2001, the big World Social Forum movements, the European Social Forum. There was a sort of big movement challenging neoliberalism and so on. And it had expression on the streets all over the world. I mean, I remember being at the big protests in Genoa and Florence and at the IMF and World Bank. So there was a real movement. And I think a new left came to the fore during that period. And similarly, when the austerity hit in 2008, the crash in 2008, there was also a resistance to that austerity, often led by the same political forces. So in Ireland, our big electoral breakthrough came because of mass popular resistance, which we were involved in organizing against austerity measures, in particular efforts to privatize water and to privatize forests in this country. And actually, we were successful in both of those campaigns. We defeated the Troika through mass mobilization, and that lifted the radical left into the parliament. But in the aftermath of that, struggle went down. I personally would trace the sort of the lack of prominence to the struggle subsiding. And I think the growth of the far right has also had an influence. I mean, I honestly think sections of right-wing politics saw a burgeoning left, a growing left. They were worried about it, and they said, how do we defeat this movement? Because they could see the danger from their point of view, from the establishment point of view, of a radical left emerging all over Europe. And I think the far right, it has been a weapon of divide and rule used to undermine the growth of the radical left. And I think that has disorientated the left in much of Europe. And some of the left have capitulated to that far right pressure by making concessions to anti-immigrant and racist arguments about, asylum seekers and so on. I think that has weakened it. What has now, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, but what is giving has changed the trajectory again in the last year or two is the mass movement of solidarity with Palestine. That has, I think, begun to push back against the far right and has begun to change things in a, I mean, although it's a horrific thing that has happened to the people of Palestine, but actually the mass movement, the unprecedented movement across the world, I think has now begun to give rise to sort of a new growth of radical left politics across the world.
Since you mentioned Palestine, actually, this links me to another question about international developments. In your speech in the Irish Parliament on the 5th of March, you were very critical of the US and Israeli actions in relation to the Middle East, as well as how the Irish government responded to these actions. How do you think Ireland's and actually the European Union's foreign policy should evolve in light of those concerns?
Well, I mean, you see, first of all, I've been campaigning on Palestine since I got involved in politics back in 1987. So because I was in Palestine during the first Intifada. So I've been campaigning on this for a very long time, and it will be very central to our politics. So it's not just, in the last few years even. And in Ireland, it will be very, very central to certainly left-wing politics, but also radical nationalist politics, the identification with the Palestinian movement because of the similarities with the resistance to colonialism here in Ireland against British rule, very similar system to the apartheid system that applied here in Ireland. So there's a huge identification with the Palestinian struggle and has been for a very long time in Ireland. But the Irish establishment, big business in Ireland, is embarrassed. I would see it. It's embarrassed by our radical anti-colonial tradition because it doesn't fit with their strategic objective to ally themselves with the European Union and with American big business. The Irish neoliberal economic model has been very much about integrating into the European Union and developing a very close relationship with American multinationals and seeking to attract, and they've done so successfully, I must say, very successfully, American multinational capital into Ireland. So all of the big IT companies have their European headquarters in Ireland. Google, Facebook, all of them. You can, X, all based here. And the Irish government do not want to upset their relationship with the United States or with the European Union establishment, all of who have been, how can we say, actively supporting Israel in one way or another. So there's a big rift in Irish politics between the political establishment that wants to kind of forget about its radical anti-colonial history and join the Western capitalist club, and a population who still very much identify with our radical anti-colonial history. So that is a very important dynamic. I mean, the protests here for Palestine over the last few years have been absolutely enormous. There's pressure on the government to impose sanctions on Israel, serious sanctions. Overwhelming support for that. But the Irish government won't do it because they don't want to upset the American capitalists or, Ursula von der Leyen and, for that matter, even their relationship with Britain. He's not in the EU, but is a close neighbor and a big economic and trading partner. So, obviously, like the rest of the Palestine solidarity movement, we're demanding sanctions are imposed on Israel, that they should be boycotted, isolated. We should do exactly to Israel what was done to apartheid South Africa. That is our view, and that would be the majority view. And that there's big campaigns all the time to that effect. Stated constantly in Parliament, but also on the streets, all over the country. But the Irish government resist doing anything because they don't want to upset the European Union establishment or the American establishment.
Yeah, thank you for those explanations and insights. I wish we could have more time to hear more about your opinions about the developments in the region and also in your country. As we come towards the end of our conversation, I would like to ask you a personal question at this point. Looking at your own intellectual journey, is there a particular book, film, philosophy, or political experience that has stayed with you and shaped how you see the world? I ask because it's always interesting to hear what inspires and motivates senior politicians such as yourself.
Well, I would not be in politics if it was not for the fact that when I was very young, I traveled to Palestine. At the time, I didn't do so for political reasons. I mean, I always say I went to Israel but came back from Palestine. So I went to work in the sun, literally. A few of us went there. We didn't know much about the politics, didn't know anything about the politics. But we ended up working alongside Palestinians who lived in refugee camps in the West Bank, but who were working and being treated very badly by Israelis. And a few weeks after I arrived, the first Palestinian Intifada started. So I was an eyewitness while I was there to the first Palestinian Intifada. And that's why I became involved in politics, because I was so inspired by the resistance of the Palestinians. I was so disgusted at the treatment of the Palestinians by the Israeli regime. I was determined to get involved in politics because of what I'd seen. And that has been the driving force in my involvement in politics ever since. And there are many books. And one interesting feature of that is when I decided to come back and get involved in politics, the first people I came across were radical and revolutionary socialists, and many of them were Jewish anti-Zionists. So there was a guy called Tony Cliff, for example, has written many, many books. He was a Trotskyist, he's dead now, but he's a revolutionary socialist who was a lifelong opponent of Zionism, even though he had been born in Mandate, Palestine in the 1930s to a Zionist family. And he's written many books. You could look him up on all aspects of revolutionary and radical politics. There was also a comrade of his who's still alive, a guy called John Rose. And I remember reading, he wrote a pamphlet called Israel, the Hijacked State. Short pamphlet, still available. Your viewers or readers could look at it. Brilliant analysis of the role that Israel had played in the Western sort of colonial carve-up of the Middle East. And it was very influential to me because it helped me understand what I had seen while I was in Palestine in terms of politically understanding it. So they would have been very early formative influences that helped me understand what I had seen in Palestine and where I should take that politically.
Richard Boyd Barrett, thank you very much for this great interview.
Thank you very much, Aki.
It was a real pleasure to speak with Richard Boyd Barrett and to engage with his perspective on the left and broader international developments. I wish him all the best in his work. For more interviews like this one, join me here at the Left Agora by subscribing to the channel. Until next time, let the Agora echo with new voices.